Welcome, everyone. My name is Amanda Thomas, and I will be your Mistress of Ceremonies this evening, and I would love to welcome you to Science on Tap. Thank you for being here. Tonight, we are here to talk about the sounds of life, how digital technology is bringing us closer to the worlds of animals and plants with Karen Bakker. And this is a really fascinating book. I don't know if any of you have looked at it already or done any research on it. It's going to be the NPR Science Friday Book of the Month next month in November. So if any of you are interested in reading along with NPR Science Friday, I encourage you to pick it up and play along at home, I guess, starting next week. So it's a really fascinating book. I'm really excited to have Karen here tonight to talk to you. A little bit about Karen. She is a professor at the University of British Columbia and also a fellow of the Harvard Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies. And we're going to show you some really fascinating photos and show you some, or have you listen to some really great sounds this evening. So let's welcome Karen to the stage. Where's the other microphone? Well, oh, you have it already. Okay, never mind. There you go. Take it away.
Thank you. So it is so great to be here. You guys have a great community, and I just learned that the people who run this are all volunteers. Can we give them a big round of applause? Because that's amazing. So tonight I'm going to take you on a little journey, a scientific journey, through the resonant mysteries of nature's sounds. So you're going to learn about how organisms with no ears or apparent means of hearing are, in fact, exquisitely sensitive to sound. You're going to learn about complex communication across the tree of life. You're going to learn about how artificial intelligence is being used to try to break the barrier of interspecies communication. In fact, some scientists have recently succeeded. And you're going to learn a little bit about the debates this is inspiring in ecology, in biology, in philosophy, about human exceptionalism and about the notion that humans alone possess complex language. These stories are from The Sounds of Life. It's a book that came out last week. It is the NPR Science Friday's Book of the Month next month. So read along. They're starting next week, which is kind of cool. So there's a lot there, because I spent 7 years researching this book. I interviewed dozens of scientists on 4 continents, and there's over 4,000 researchers cited in the book. So I'm just going to cover 5 themes tonight. The first one is nature's symphony. So the breakthrough technology that I talk about in the book is something called digital bioacoustics. So essentially, that uses miniaturized recorders, pretty much similar to what you have in your smartphones. And those miniaturized recorders basically do the job of technology that used to fill an entire minivan. So the advent of these very small, lightweight, portable, cheap, automated recorders about 10 years ago enabled scientists to go out and start recording the sounds of nature everywhere from the depths of the ocean to the highest mountaintop, from the Arctic to the Amazon, and also recording those sounds at frequencies we cannot hear. Humans privilege sight over sound. We're not actually very good listeners, like at many levels. But one of the things that we're not good at is listening in the high ultrasound. That's the realm of bats and dolphins, moths and mice. Plants make ultrasound. We can't hear it, but many animals can. So those digital recorders are out there recording all of that ultrasound. The digital recorders are also recording infrasound. That's below the lower end of our hearing range. That's the realm of thunder and tornadoes and elephants and whales. Our planet itself makes infrasound, which we cannot hear. Even a very loud infrasound right next to you, you wouldn't hear it. You might sense a sort of strange, uneasy feeling in your chest. But all of these sounds pass us by. But for the majority of our cousins on the tree of life, there's sort of a resonant, continuous symphony of sound that they're listening to. And so I'll introduce you to some of those sounds tonight. I'll also talk a little bit about the tech, because I think it's cool. So this book is actually part of a a bigger project I run at the University of British Columbia called the Smart Earth Project. And that project is looking at how we can mobilize the tools of the digital age to potentially address some of the most challenging problems of the Anthropocene, like biodiversity loss and climate change. And the sort of existential question of that project is, could digital technologies, which have so many problems and which are so often associated with our alienation from nature, could in some fashion those technologies bring us closer to nature? Could they reconnect us instead? And so I wanted you to know a little bit about the tech because there's some citizen science aspects that are super cool. Then we'll move to a discussion of non-human language, because the scientists are not stopping at merely recording these sounds. They are using artificial intelligence algorithms, natural language processing, very similar to what powers Google Translate, to decode non-human language. And I use the word language with lots of caveats, as a good scientist would. But essentially what we're finding is that non-human vocalizations have many patterns that are analogous to syntax, kind of combinatorial patterns that we associate with complex language, symbolic meaning. Animals have names. Animals teach their young how to speak, much like we do. So non-human language exists much further across the tree of life than we previously realized. This is leading some scientists to believe that we are on the brink of breaking the barrier of interspecies communication. And for some species that I'll talk about, we have actually made some breakthroughs. We're actually using artificial intelligence and robots to engage in two-way communication with other species. This raises all sorts of ethical questions. It's definitely that uncanny valley kind of feeling that digital tech can give you. So I'll bring you through some of the maybe more bizarre and creepy corners of this research agenda. And I'll conclude by talking about one of the sort of shocking findings that scientists have come across. We know that noise pollution is bad for us. Even the ambient levels of noise pollution in the average city are associated with higher cardiovascular risk, stroke, heart attack, stress, cognitive impairment, even dementia for humans. We know this, but what we didn't know is that industrial and machine noise is much, much worse for other species than it is for us. We're now learning about the impacts, and this is sparking a sort of silent spring moment, where we're going to see an overhaul of environmental conservation, regulation, not without a fight, and I think there's some really complex questions here from a governance perspective, but I think it's really important because I feel very strongly about this as a sort of call to action on the biodiversity front. So let's bring some other voices into the room. Who do you think is making this sound? Not a bird. Not a mouse. Not a monkey. Oh, moth, we're actually getting closer. But this is a bat. So that's a bat. That bat sound has been slowed down so that we can hear it. Bats speak in the ultrasound. For decades, we've known about their echolocation capabilities. That is, the use of sound, like a highly tuned acoustic flashlight, as precise as our finest medical devices. Bats use this to navigate, to hunt prey on the wing. But only more recently have we begun to realize that they have a very complex vocabulary. So they're not using sound only to echolocate, they're also using it to communicate. So there's some fascinating work that's being done that I'll explore a little bit later about bat language. But I wanted to point out just a couple of other things about species that also communicate in ultrasonic. So dolphin echolocation is probably one you've all heard of. It's one of the best known. Again, we've known about this capability for decades, but only recently have researchers begun expanding their studies into the use of ultrasonic patterns in dolphin language, learning, for example, that dolphins actually have individual names. And I'll return to that question of animal names in a moment. Now, charismatic megafauna, well, I don't know if you call bats charismatic, but for me, they're very charismatic. So charismatic megafauna have long attracted our attention. But we didn't realize that many other creatures are also making noise in the ultrasound. This is one of your long-lost cousins. This is a tarsier. Way back in time, we share a common ancestor. And at that point, our ancestors could communicate in ultrasound. Tarsiers still can, as can many rodents, shrews, mice. At the other end of human hearing range, of course, is the ultrasound. And I wanted just to play a little bit of elephant. Now, the discovery of elephant infrasound was made by one of the heroes of 20th century bioacoustics, Katie Payne. She was a classically trained musician, worked with her husband, Roger Payne, on that whale song album. She was the one who decoded all of the whale songs and their structure. She even started channeling whale song at one point and would ululate these very complex humpback songs in their living room to the surprise of visitors. But she then went off to Africa, to East Africa, in the middle of a time that some of you might remember. It was a time of widespread slaughter of elephants before the international ban on the ivory trade. And she began listening to elephants and felt some of the same feelings, because you can sometimes feel infrasound in your body, even if you can't hear it, that she had felt listening to whales. And her discovery of infrasound opened up an amazing world for scientists. For one thing, it explained a fairly uncanny telepathic ability of elephants to coordinate their behaviors long distances across the savannah, dozens of miles apart, far beyond audible hearing range or even biochemical. Like, there's no way they're communicating through any means known to scientists. Elephants are coordinating their behavior to meet up at certain points, to follow certain paths. And it turns out they're using infrasound, these very long, low, slow sound waves. They're so powerful. They travel through soil, through stone, through walls. And so this is how elephants communicate. And as we've begun studying these sounds, we have found patterns in those sounds that contain a lot of complex information, whereby elephants are describing their environment to one another, warning one another, greeting one another, naming one another, and most likely transmitting oral history. So we knew about elephants, but we didn't know about lots of other species. The peacock question in the trivia, this was not known to scientists until relatively recently. It was actually discovered by accident. There was a researcher named James O'Hare studying squirrel infrasound. Okay, they make infrasound, how cool is that? But he noticed a male peacock standing in a zoo facing a wall and sort of doing its tail rattling, and thought that shape looks kind of like, I don't know, like a resonating shape. And he turned on his listening device, and lo and behold, the peacock was making a very loud infrasonic noise. And it turns out this is a major determinant of success in the peacock's mating dance. So the peacock love song is quite cool because they're rattling their tails. It's making a frequency that the biomechanics of the tail then resonate. You see that little crest on top of the peacock head? The peahen also has a crest. That frequency gets this little crest vibrating, and then the peahen's little crest on her head starts vibrating along with this sound. So all of this should have been very obvious to us. We've known about the peacock's mating dance, of course, for centuries, but somehow it completely passed us by. And I think this is a great example of a human truth that humans tend to believe that what we cannot observe does not exist. And there are many, many other species for which this is true. Tigers, for example, also make sound in the infrasound. Hippopotami, lots of other species, but also the Earth itself. So if you could turn on one of these digital recording devices right now, you would actually be able to hear the Earth itself. You could hear the howl of a hurricane, the calving of a glacier. You could hear ocean waves crashing on continental shelves. Those resonate at very low frequencies, kind of like the heartbeat of our planet. It's a very rhythmic, low motion. When earthquakes happen, they resonate the atmosphere in the infrasound, a little bit like a quiet bell. So animals are listening to all of this. This escapes us, but this geophony, as it's called, is part of that symphony of nature, resonating at all of these frequencies, continuously sounding around us. I couldn't do a presentation on animal sound without letting you listen to a little whale. So here's some whale infrasound. I could listen to whale all night, but I've got more slides to get through. One thing I will say, though, is that human culture is about, oh my God, what did the whale do? Human culture is far outpaced by whale culture. The current thinking is that whales express some form of oral history in their songs. When the songs were first discovered, they were sort of described as songs without words. But scientists, there's a great team at Berkeley and MIT at the moment trying to decode whale language, trying to parse it into individual words. If indeed whales do have oral history, that culture has been passed down for millennia, and we might have a lot to learn. So our ability to access all of these sounds is, of course, not new. Deep listening is a venerable and ancient art. There are many forms of traditional knowledge that enable us to live in relationship with place, to listen to other species, to learn their languages. So digital listening is a relatively new tool in the human toolkit. It's a pretty interesting one, in part because, as I mentioned, it takes the same technologies that you have in your smartphones, miniaturized recorders, and it makes them available not only to professional scientists, but also citizen scientists. So one of these photos is actually an audio model. You can't see it. Oh, well, if you could, it'd be quite cool. There's those little devices that sit on trees. They are like, you can fit them in the palm of your hand. And essentially, DIY devices you can order on the internet, $30 or less. And you can be out there listening to nature. And so there's been a real explosion in digital bioacoustics. And the ability to listen to nature has kind of created a tsunami of data. You know, one of the great constraints on environmental understanding of the 20th century was a scarcity of data. Now we have a hyperabundance of sonic data, and scientists are just beginning to decode that data. One of the ways in which they do this, as was mentioned in the trivia questions, is through ecoacoustics. So you can use these devices to listen to individual organisms, or you can listen to entire soundscapes or landscapes. And when you do, you can learn a lot about an ecosystem just by listening. So a camera captures an animal walking down the forest path, but a recorder can hear them hiding in the bushes. So scientists have used digital recorders to discover entirely new species. There's one group that discovered an entirely new species of blue whale in the Indian Ocean that no one had ever seen because they spend most of their lives deep below the surface, yet their unique vocal signatures gave them away. Scientists have also discovered species that have gone, we thought, extinct by listening for them. And so these devices that can listen, of course, in 360 degrees, 24/7, 365 days a year, even in remote places, without human disturbance, that's really key, are revealing a lot more to us than visual technologies alone. There's a very cute picture of a frog here, and you're all supposed to say, "Aww, aww, this is the cutest frog." Okay, oh well. So one of the cool things about this technology that I love is you can begin to use these soundscape recordings, which you can print out as spectrograms, which are sort of like a visual renderings of the changing sound frequencies. You can use those a bit like a radiologist looking at an MRI scan. So you can look at these images and you can see, is it acoustically rich? Is it acoustically diverse? Is it healthy? If an intervention happens in a landscape like logging, what happens to the soundscape? Sometimes the soundscape will start to be degraded well before we can see the changes, particularly if we're talking about anything happening below a forest canopy. So scientists are starting to use these spectrograms and these soundscapes as a way to actually basically monitor ecosystem health. And we're able to do this at far lower cost and in far more places than we previously were able to. So that's creating a kind of revolution in conservation, which as a scientist I'm pretty excited about. So the next topic is non-human language, and I hope we get our visuals back because there's some pretty cool sci-fi kind of stuff. So as I mentioned, there are these huge data sets that we're now generating of digital recordings. They are almost actually too much for researchers to handle. We've got, millions and millions of vocalizations. Yossi Yavel at the University of Tel Aviv in Israel went in and recorded one bat cave, 15 million vocalizations. We can train AI algorithms, natural language processing algorithms, on these data sets, much like scientists did for Google Translate. And when we do so, we detect patterns. So let me tell you about some of the things we're finding. Let's start with bats. So bats, it turns out, have so they're quite close to us on the tree of life, right? 1/4 of all mammalian species. And although we often have negative connotations with bats, creatures of the night, blood-sucking, vampires. I mean, I don't hold these biases personally, but they're out there. It turns out that bats are incredibly complex communicators. And Gerald Carter at Ohio State has done fantastic work combining bioacoustics data sets with little tags you put on the backs of these bats that kind of function like air tags. So they're collecting movement data. Who's talking to who's saying what to who's talking behind whose back. So what they are finding out is pretty amazing. So bats remember favors, bats hold grudges, bats fight for position, they trade food for sex, they socially distance when ill, they go quiet and socially distance when ill. Mother bats babble to their babies very much like human parents will babble to babies. When you're first, you get this baby and you find yourself babbling at it and you don't know why, and that's how human babies learn. So mother bats do the same thing. And baby bats eventually learn adult language and they learn their territorial songs that are so important to sing, to defend their territory, to find mates, which are also markers of culture. Each bat group has its own unique dialect, its culture, which persists over time. Bats have individual names, they can distinguish genders, and we're only at the beginning. This research has only been done in the past couple of years, and we're finding out pretty astounding things. There's a researcher named Mirjam Knornschild at the Natural History Museum in Berlin, and her next set of experiments, the hypothesis she is currently testing is whether or not bats are capable of symbolic communication. So about 2 decades ago, researchers created these sort of like touchscreen iPads for dolphins, which dolphins can touch using their acoustic beams, right? So to us, it would look like they're not touching them because they don't go up and like hit it with their nose, but they're actually using their acoustic beam to hit the screen. And so that's one of the tools we use to determine dolphins are capable of symbolic communication. So now we're designing the same experiments for bats. So we can test, for example, do they have numeric competence? Can they distinguish between shapes? Or other questions that researchers might want to pose. So bats are only one example of species for which, you know, the whole world of non-human communication is opening up to us. What's pretty astounding about this is the degree to which we're able now to do these experiments on species that scientists once thought were mute. A great example is the South American river turtle, Podocnemus expansa. Right now there's a very cute picture of a baby turtle up, and you can all say, "Oh, oh." Okay, so these creatures, these turtles, Podocnemus expansa, once roamed the Amazon, much like buffalo on the prairies. There were that tens of thousands would haul out on the beaches. They were, I'm trying to find words that are like not triggering. Colonists viewed them as a source of meat and cash. Turtles were slaughtered. Turtle eggs were harvested by the millions. And as a result, very few turtles now remain in the Amazon today. Now, for a long time, scientists who study turtles, who are called herpetologists, believed that turtles were mute. They were deaf and dumb. There's a great story in the book, a young turtle scientist named Christina Davey who picks up a turtle. She's a grad student. The turtle makes a noise. She says in astonishment to the senior researcher standing beside her, "The turtle made a noise." And the researcher says, "That's nonsense. I've been working with turtles for decades. They don't make noise." And she brings it up again, but she's politely encouraged to let the matter drop. But of course, scientists were the ones that were hard of hearing. So there are a couple of very brave, and I mean brave, young researchers. One is Dr. Camila Ferrara in Brazil. She works with the Wildlife Conservation Society there, and Dr. Julia Giles in Australia. And despite being told they were crazy, despite being told they would never get their PhDs, they spent several years of their lives out in swamps, in rivers, trying to record turtle sounds, something they were told didn't exist. And it does, but it's actually pretty hard for us to hear, not only because the frequencies are on the very edge of our hearing range, but also because turtles are very different speakers than us. So the noises are very low volume. If you're in the water paddling your feet or bubbles, you're not going to hear those noises. You have to be exceptionally quiet. And also an have a very long turn-taking ratio. So what does that mean? So when I'm talking to another human, typically there's going to be an interval, and we do this naturally without thinking. The turn-taking interval between when I stop speaking and you start speaking is a half a second to a second. It might vary a bit between cultures, but it's not that long. Birds are the same. However, turtles might wait a minute or two before responding to one another. They're very polite. They're very slow. So you have to sit there for hours. So they're very low. They're very slow communicators. And so it takes sort of infinite patience to be recording these sounds. But these researchers did, and they found that turtles made incredible sounds with great vocal complexity associated with behavioral with meaningful behavioral actions that indicate that they're coordinating behavior, solving, by the way, a great mystery of the Amazon, which is nobody knows, but somehow, all at once a year, all the remaining turtles swim across the vastness of the Amazon, find one or two beaches, and they all come together to lay their eggs at the same time. And no one knew how they did this, and now we know. They're talking to each other. Hey guys, time to go to the beach. So, when those turtles get to the beach, they lay their eggs. And one of the things Camilla Ferrara did is she went and she put some microphones into the nests. She did this actually just as a control because she wanted to know when the turtles would start speaking after they were born. To her amazement, the turtle embryos, before they hatched, while they were still in the shells, were making lots of noise through the eggshells. And it turns out there's a specific sound they're using to coordinate the moment of their birth. So scientists used to think, okay, why are all the turtle babies born at once? Well, it just must be some kind of, biological clock or the cycles of the moon. We didn't really know. Now we know. They're deciding when to be born together. Obviously, they're evolutionary, their advantages, right? You reduce the risk of predation. But the other very cool thing was the mother turtles didn't swim off, as scientists thought. They assumed, not mammals. The parents don't care. But in fact, mother turtles are in the water calling to their babies, and they guide them, so they also monitor them with drones and tags, and they swim off to the flooded forest. Oh, there's Camilla, yay. So they swim off together to the flooded forest, and this research provided the first evidence of parental care in turtles. Now, this might sound astounding, right? But kind of believable because we're human, we're anthropocentric, and turtles, well, they're kind of cute, and at least, they're kind of like us, like they have eyes, they have ears. The most astounding research for me personally is the research on species that are very far from us on the tree of life, like coral. So here's a picture of Steve Simpson. He has the world's best job. He gets to go scuba diving in reefs around the world, listening to nature. Here he is with his bioacoustics array. And one of the things that Steve Simpson studies is fish larvae. So through very painstaking experiments, he and his team demonstrated over a number of years that fish larvae, when they're born, choose where to settle. Fish typically pick reefs on which to settle after they've reached a certain stage of maturity, and the assumption was that that was random. But they were able to show with these very cool experimental designs called choice chambers that the fish larvae actually have a preference. They like healthy reefs rather than unhealthy reefs, and they prefer the sound of their home reef rather than any random sound. So the fish larvae are something that had been subjected to experiments. Oh my God, I think they're bringing me wine, and I think I really deserve it. So awesome, thank you. So here are these little fish larvae, and they're, imagine this, okay? You've got this big tank. It's like an aquarium, and you've got all these little arms coming off the tank, and at one end you might play white noise, at one end no noise, at one end, Metallica, I don't know, at one end hip hop, whatever. And then you've got beautiful, healthy reef noise, and the fish larvae, these tiny little creatures, are swimming towards the healthy reef noise. They all sort of cluster up this one arm, kind of like a Finding Nemo moment. And one day, a group of researchers, young researchers, said to Steve Simpson, why don't we put a bunch of coral larvae in the tank? Now, to understand how ridiculous this must have sounded, coral larvae have no central nervous system. They are basically, as Steve put it in highly technical language, he's like, guys, these are just blobs with like hair on the outside of their bodies, cilia. They're not going to swim toward the sound. But he was convinced to try, and to his amazement, the coral larvae would just like the fish larvae, swim towards the sound of healthy reefs. And in fact, they would swim towards the sound of their home reefs. And then they controlled for the cycles of the moon and the tides, and because larval behavior is actually sensitive to all these things, found the same result, and did the same studies out in the ocean. Like, talk about devotion, tracking coral larvae across miles of ocean, and they found the same result. So this puts coral larvae in the same category as other species that do these heroic migrations, you know, like think of the birds that migrate across entire continents, or salmon that migrate thousands of miles, or a little coral larva, even a few miles across the open ocean with wind and currents. That's a similarly heroic feat. We don't know how they do it. So what Simpson speculates is that coral larvae, at the moment of their birth, you know, these beautiful spawnings that occur at the full moon, like underwater fireworks, before the coral larvae are washed out to sea, at that point they are sonically imprinting, in a way we do not understand, on the sound of their home reef. And even weeks or months later, they can swim home. We have no idea how they do this, but they do. So, sound is a fundamental form of transmitting energy. It is probably older than sight. Probably anything in nature that has cilia can hear. Of course, that's how we hear. The little hairs inside your ears are vibrating right now as I'm speaking. So many species hear in a similar way, even plants. And I want to mention just one experiment briefly to illustrate how cool this is. Heidi Apple at the University of Toledo did an experiment a few years ago where she played some sounds to plants, and then she measured the defense chemicals, the biochemicals that they secreted. She took a fairly standard plant. It's a model organism in biology, Arabidopsis thaliana. It's like a common plant. And she played it, you know, just normal sounds of wind, of rain, and then she played it the sound of an insect chewing on leaves. Only the sound of the insect chewing on leaves caused that plant to produce these defense chemicals. And then she got even more curious, and she played it 2 different insects. One that was actually chewing on the plant in question, that was really a threat to that species, and another insect chewing on another kind of plant that wasn't a threat. Now the sounds were similar, but 2 different insects, one threatening, one not. The plant only released its defensive chemicals when it heard the predator that was its predator. So the nuance and the exquisite attunement of that particular plant species to its predator was revealed by that experiment. And the explanation of how they can hear is that they have tiny little hairs or hair equivalents on the external surface of their leaves. So they can hear with their entire bodies, and they can discern ecologically relevant information from what they are hearing. And of course, that means their hearing is orders of magnitude more sensitive than our own. All of this is leading scientists to wonder whether we now know enough to engage in interspecies communication. So, interspecies communication is already happening all around us because we have growing evidence of sonic exchanges between different species. Here's one. Yossi Yavel at the University of Tel Aviv did a great set of experiments looking at how bees communicate with flowers. Scientists used to think that flowers were kind of passive, and the bees would come and shake the flowers and do what they do. But it turns out that if you play the sound of a buzzing bee close to a flower, it will produce more nectar and sweeter nectar within minutes, within a very small proportion of time, as if anticipating the arrival of the bee. Similarly, plants that are pollinated by bats have evolved over time to create shapes that are attuned to that acoustic flashlight, that echolocation that bats are using. So they use a whole variety of strategies. Some shapes of leaves are sort of acoustically invariant to so they would attract the bat's attention. Others sort of absorb a lot. Others reflect a lot. All of these strategies are to one end, which is to attract the bats to the plants in order for the bats to pollinate them. So acoustic attunement has evolved and species are communicating between one another. But the question that scientists are now asking is whether humans could also be engaging in this communication. So the analogy historically is, of course, the Rosetta Stone, that archaeological object that allowed us to decode Egyptian hieroglyphics, because when it was found, it contained the same text written in 3 different languages, one of which archaeologists knew quite well, and they could thus use to decode the mystery of Egyptian hieroglyphics. Are we at the same point? Are we going to be able to have a digital Rosetta Stone for non-human languages? So we may, and we would be using natural language processing to achieve that. This image is the image of the Portuguese language. So what this is like a galaxy, okay? Each star is a word, and the distance between each two stars is related to how, a number of parameters, how frequently the word is spoken, and how often the two words are spoken close to one another. So it turns out that you can map any human language like this. So basically you're turning semantic relationships into geometric relationships, like algebraic relationships. And so most human languages have now been mapped that way. This is what enables Google Translate to translate between English and Swahili on your phone. And when they adopted this approach, Google Translate got a lot better a few years ago. So you can do lots of cool things in human languages, and it turns out that they're remarkably invariant geometrically. What do I mean by that? I mean that the semantic relationship that is expressed by, let's say, theater and audience in my word galaxy, those would be quite close together. The mathematical distance between those two words would be quite small. And that's invariant, and so one can easily translate between one language and another, assuming that's some kind of invariance, assuming, of course, common cultural understandings of things like theater and audience. So the conjecture, and I should add it's just a conjecture, is that we're going to be able to do something similar for non-human languages. We can look for patterns. So for example, one well-known pattern in human languages is the Zipf-Mandelbrot law. That is, the more frequently a word is spoken, the shorter it is. That has an energetic reason to it. If you think about it, it's very energetically expensive to say supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. And so most of the words we say are a lot shorter than that. And indeed, that relationship, that law of linguistics holds across all human languages, as far as we're aware. So we can start looking for these laws, if you like. Now, philosophers would say this is an impossible task. Ludwig Wittgenstein is famous for saying, if a lion could speak, we couldn't understand them. Thomas Nagel wrote a very influential paper arguing that we could never understand the language of a bat because the bat's Umwelt, their lived experience of being embodied in the bat's world and the bat's body, is so different from ours that there are no cognate concepts. Now that may be true. It's not stopping scientists from trying. And the counter to the argument of philosophers like Wittgenstein and Nagel is that it may be that your body cannot buzz like a bee or ululate like a whale, but our computers and our robots can. So to give a sense of really how challenging this would be, like honeybee. Listen. Using artificial intelligence, we now know that honeybees have over 200 unique vocalizations that we think mean something. We don't know what they all mean. We know what stop, we know the stop sound, we know what the waggle dance means, but most of these we haven't yet really figured out. But the pattern recognition ability of AI is so good now that we have a pretty good sense of what those patterns are. And if you superimpose an acoustic data set with a computer vision data set, you're starting to match sounds to behaviors, and perhaps you are indeed beginning to decode these languages. This is Tim Landgraf at the Free University of Berlin. He has gone the farthest in this line of research with bees. This is Tim's robot. Tim trained his robot using an AI algorithm. His robot will go into the hive, and Tim can tell his robot to tell the bees to stop, and they will stop. And he can also tell his robot to do that famous waggle dance, that very complicated dance that's vibrational and positional, depends on the angle of the bee's body to gravity and the position of the sun, because bees can see polarized light. And all of that is encoded into this honeybee robot that can tell the bees where to go for a new nectar source they have not previously discovered, and those instructions work. So this is the uncanny valley of honeybee rudimentary interspecies communication with honeybees. So the next stage in Tim's work is to incorporate these kinds of robots into beehives as they are newly colonized by bees, so that the robot is recognized as what scientists call a conspecific, a true member of that community, allowing information to be conveyed from humans to the hive, with the interests of protecting them, so says Tim, which I think is admirable, but of course raises the prospect of a further domestication of a species. And indeed, there are some military uses of this technology that are not as benign. Other researchers are trying to do similar things for whale language. There are two teams. One is a team of researchers at MIT and Berkeley trying to decode sperm whalish. There's another team that's spun out of Silicon Valley, people who are early in at Twitter and Facebook, who've also put very significant resources into the race to decode sperm whalish. Sperm whales are very cool, obviously, they're very big brains, very big animals. They could make sounds so loud they would burst your eardrums and probably vibrate you to death if you were swimming near them. So this is, not for the faint of heart to go swimming with a sperm whale. But they have very cool language that's a bit like Morse code. And because they are long-lived, we know they have cultural dialects, they're highly social. If we're going to find language in any other species, which AI could really be used as a translation device, it's likely going to be in a species like this. So these scientists believe that within 10 to 15 years, we will have a zoological version of Google Translate. Not quite literally, but someone will be able to open up their computer somewhere, and you will have, in addition to Esperanto and Mandarin, you'll have an option for Southern Australian dolphin, East African elephant, and sperm whalish. And we'll have broken the code of interspecies communication. So this raises lots of ethical questions about the potential misuses of this technology, whether we would use this for domestication of other species, particularly wild species, and what safeguards are in place, and I hope we get to talk about that in the question period. But I also wanted to mention in closing one more issue, which is that of noise pollution. So I mentioned at the outset of the talk that the researchers, as they've started recording these sounds, have begun to realize the pernicious effects of noise pollution on other species. So as we've realized that they are often exquisitely sensitive to sound, way more than humans, we've begun documenting the effects that noise pollution has on other species. Those effects include hampering reproduction, increased stress, shorter lives. In some cases, very loud seismic blasts in the ocean can actually kill outright. So scientists have documented zooplankton, the base of the oceanic food chain, being killed outright by seismic blasts up to a mile from the blast site. So we now know enough about noise pollution in humans to be starting to attempt to engage in noise abatement. This is a picture of a noise radar in Paris. If you've ever spent time in Europe or France, you know about those two-stroke engine scooters that are so loud. The estimate is that even one of those drives through Parisian streets at night for 10 minutes, they can wake up hundreds of thousands of people. So this little device will actually measure the decibel level of passing vehicles, and if it's above the legal limit, a photo is taken of the license plate and the owner is fined. So great, that's great for us, but what about for non-humans? And when I say non-humans, I mean not only animals, but plants. This is a picture of a moray eel hiding in Posidonia oceanica. This particular seagrass is found in the Mediterranean, and we think it's the oldest living organism in the world. Scientists estimate that it's between 100,000 and 200,000 years old. It reproduces clonally, and of course seagrass meadows are as important to our planet as the great forests of the Boreal or the Amazon because they act as a carbon sink. They are cradles for nurturing young of many, many species. And seagrass has been disappearing at an alarming rate over the past few decades. So last year, scientists in Barcelona decided to do something a bit crazy, a bit like what Steve Simpson did when he put coral larvae into his choice chambers instead of fish larvae. They had been doing experiments on octopi. Octopi hear with their arms. They have these little organs in their arms. They're exquisitely sensitive to sound. So they had been doing experiments in their aquariums on octopus sensitivity to sound. And one day, one of the researchers decided to put Posidonia oceanica in the tanks instead. The plants were subjected to a very loud blast, very similar to that from a seismic explosion. And when they examined them under the microscope, what they found was that the little organelles that plants use to hear, which are called, in this case, statocysts, they help plants orient to gravity, they help them absorb food. They found that those little organelles had been basically destroyed, ruptured, blown open. So the analogy would be, imagine if a loud siren went by right now, and it not only deafened you permanently, but it ruptured your stomach so you couldn't absorb food, and it disrupted your sense of balance so you couldn't walk upright. That is the effect of sound on a plant like this. And not only plants, there was an article in Science just a year and a half ago talking about new findings regarding motorboat noise. Even relatively quiet motorboats on coral reefs can basically kill fish embryos while they're still in their eggs, as the tagline for the article put it bluntly, human noise is scrambling baby fish eggs. So we had no idea until recently that other species were so sensitive to sound. Now that we do, the question is, what do we do about it? I mean, it means a complete overhaul of environmental regulation, new noise standards, new approaches to ecosystem monitoring using soundscapes. Luckily, we're at a new era in environmental governance where we have an abundance of data rather than a scarcity of data, and we're able to use a lot of these systems for real-time monitoring to prevent and predict rather than merely react. I'll close with one hopeful note about bioacoustics being used to save endangered species. So off the east coast of North America lives a population of endangered right whales, North Atlantic right whales. There are only about 400 left. A few years ago, they had to leave their home off the coast of Maine because that area became one of the fastest warming areas of the planet. You remember the huge heat wave that hit the ocean, and the favored food of the right whales, little tiny copepods, basically disappeared. The habitat was no longer conducive, the copepods were gone, and the right whales became climate refugees. They headed north. They were found a few months later, several hundred miles later, in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. That's where the mighty St. Lawrence flows into the Atlantic, a rich nutrient upwelling, lots of food, great place to pick if you're a climate refugee. The only problem is that's also one of the busiest shipping areas in the world. So it's, you've got this great buffet lunch, but it's like trying to eat lunch on a 12-lane highway while dodging the cars. So what happened, tragically, is that the whales started getting hit by ships and also getting tangled in fishing lines. No one knew what to do until one researcher named Kimberly Davies at the University of New Brunswick said that she had the solution. And what she did, she was a longtime bioacoustics researcher who'd been listening to whales. She put her acoustic aquatic gliders, they're like underwater drones in the water. These are now so precise they can triangulate the location of whales to a high degree of accuracy. Remember, they're spending a lot of their time below the surface. Visual surveys are not going to cut it. And what she was able to do is create a system that conveys that information to the locational information to regulators, ships' captains, and fishers in real time. Now, when a whale is heard with this system, within a radius of 1,000 miles, all fishing activity must stop. Ships must slow down or get out of the way. The fine is $250,000. And the system has worked. It was implemented in 2019, and since then, not a single whale death by ship strike in 2019, 2020, 2021, or, knock on wood, 2022, which may end up being the thing that saves this highly threatened population from extinction. We're now creating something on the West Coast called Whale Save. That's been up and running. It's voluntary, but also working with very similar technologies, even actually a more sophisticated array. There's tags monitoring the whales. We've got satellites. We've got oceanic predictive models based on temperature, all of which feed information to ship captains to tell them where the whales are likely to be so the ships can get out of the way. So just stop and think about that for a second. We have a situation where 400 whales control the movements of tens of thousands of ships in a watershed that's home to 45 million people. And the whales are choosing where they want to be, and we have to get out of their way. And in fact, scientists are so thrilled by the success of this initiative that they're now arguing we need to scale it up planetary-wide. The plan is actually to create networks that follow the fish, mobile protected areas for the 21st century. They're now doing this with turtles in Hawaii, tuna, endangered tuna off the coast of Australia. And so the intention is a 21st century network of mobile marine protected areas that we can use, particularly relevant in an era of climate change when so many habitats are changing and aquatic species are moving in ways that we can't fully predict or fully understand. So I don't want to offer false hope, but in a time of sort of climate emergency, I think these are a set of useful tools. We may one day indeed break the code of interspecies communication for good or for ill, but in the meantime, there's a lot we can do to address noise pollution and use some of these tools to protect our cousins on the tree of life. So with that, I hope I've left you with some food for thought, and I look forward to your questions.
Hey, there I am. I am so glad to hear that the sound devices were telling people where the whales were so that they could get out of the way rather than trying to draw the whales away from the shipping lanes.
Yeah, but I was just giving a talk in San Francisco yesterday, and some of the new experiments they're discussing would be experiments that would tell the whales to dive to get out of the way of an oncoming ship. Of course, very problematic because, it's very energetically costly for a whale to dive. What if it's not the right time? What if they have young with them? So, it is a hopeful experiment, but the safeguards are not necessarily in place to prevent what you're talking about.
Maybe a combination, but I like the way they're doing it in Canada better. Which, generally. If any of you have questions, please raise your hand. I can come around I'll put my mask back on, but I'll come around and we'll get to as many questions as we can. I'm going to start with an actual question. I recognize that many of the things that you are talking about are systemic or changes at government or the societal levels. But I'm wondering if doing this research has caused you to change any of your own behavior in your life or your home.
That's a great question. I mean, there's a lot of stuff you can do, and in the appendix to the book, I put a lot of references to the apps that you can have on your devices to get out and do some of this sort of science work, and I do that with some of my family. And sound walks. Sound walks are very cool, you know? We think going out for a walk in nature, we're largely looking, great. What about listening? So those are some of the things you can do, and we do as a family. Another byproduct of this research is I'm really sensitive to noise in a way that I never was before, and I realize how much we filter out as a protective mechanism or as a habit. So for better or worse, once your ears open up, you can shut your eyes when you go to sleep, but you can't shut your ears. And at some point you start to hear a lot more, and that's both wonderful and distracting, I guess.
So possibly a two-part question. Do you know anything about salmon and salmon runs? Like, they tend to be pretty much at the same time, depending on the species. And, kind of the working theory is taste. They taste the water coming down or
Yeah.
the temperature. Is there any research on sound and them coordinating the runs that they make up river?
It's a great question. So yes, so a lot of the assumption is, and salmon, it's true, they can taste the taste of their spawning area in a very small amount of water, like these very minuscule. So that's definitely something they're using. Biochemical. There's a biochemical aspect to salmon migration, but it's what scientists now also believe is that phenology, which is the general scientific study of the timing of biological events, be it when salmon migrate, when trees flower, etc. There's probably an acoustic element. Now, what that would actually be in the salmon's case, we haven't totally determined. There's been more work on birds, what would trigger migrations. But it's quite likely that the salmon are hearing sounds associated with water flow from rivers, that there are lots of things they're attuned to. So hold that thought. I bet you if I was back here in 5 years, I'd have an answer. Not yet.
So my follow-up question to that is, assuming that there is an answer coming to that.
Assuming there's an answer.
To calling the salmon in. Like, do you foresee a future where, like, maybe the fishermen are like, oh, I don't have to look for the tuna, I can just crank these tuna beats and get them swimming over here because they think it's,
Yeah.
I don't know. Whatever.
Well, people already are. I'll tell you about one cool experiment. So Steve Simpson, who I mentioned, and a grad student named Tim Gordon, and they were very concerned about coral reefs disappearing, and so they decided to do essentially music therapy experiments. They're not hunting, they're not fishing. What they have done is set up speakers underwater on degraded reefs, and they play the sounds of healthy reefs. And what they have found is that attracts coral and fish larvae to the reef, and they then settle, and it accelerates reef regeneration, which is not going to solve the problem of the disappearance of coral reefs due to climate change, but it may aid in a global initiative that's now underway to restore some reefs. It's kind of like a triage approach. And so that music therapy for coral reefs is now being used. And of course, it could be misused to lure species for hunting. Digital technologies allow us to engage in precision hunting on land and on sea. That's true for visual. There's a whole Internet of Earthlings I didn't have time to talk about, which uses satellite tagging technology, Project Icarus. So you're right, and what worries me is we don't have a lot of safeguards in place for that yet. We have very few, actually. So one of the things I'm hoping to spark in the scientific community is a conversation about just that.
Hi, can you talk a little bit about whether indigenous knowledge has contributed to sound research of animals and such?
It has, and in each chapter of the book, I sort of interweave deep listening and digital listening. And Robin Wall Kimmerer has a great quote in her book, her beautiful book, Braiding Sweetgrass. And it runs something like this. She says, I smile when I smile when my colleagues say they discovered X. That's a bit like Columbus saying they discovered America, right? These are often rediscoveries of knowledge long held, not always acknowledged. The first 2 chapters of the book are an extended discussion of one of the major longitudinal bioacoustic studies in the 20th century in Alaska, the Inupiat. And they were the Inupiat were the ones that actually launched pretty much this entire field. Their traditional bowhead whale hunting was under threat because the International Whaling Commission unilaterally decided to cancel the subsistence hunt without consulting with the Inupiat. The Inupiat were convinced that the bowhead whale population was far more numerous than Western scientists who relied on visual survey methods, that those populations were far more abundant than Western scientists understood, and they used acoustic methods, holding a wooden oar to your jaw to listen to the vibrations and hearing the whales and the seals and many other creatures. So very sophisticated techniques. They invited some Western researchers up, Chris Clark from Cornell. They ran studies for nearly 2 decades. They're still going on, and essentially, with the guidance of a particular elder, Harry Brower, developed these amazing experimental protocols that demonstrated that, in fact, bowheads were communicating acoustically. They were far more numerous than Western scientists had understood, and moreover, that bowheads possessed complex culture, songs, dialects. They turned out to be way longer lived than scientists had realized, up to 200 years. So many of the aspects of traditional knowledge through this collaborative research were shared with Western science that had a lot of catch up to do. And many of these other examples, there are indigenous analogs, and in each chapter of the book, I interweave those stories and ask some questions about why, what is it about Western science that caused scientists to overlook this knowledge? One of the issues is a long-standing privileging of sight over sound in science, the faculty of sight versus the faculty of sound. Another is, as you're all familiar with, I'm sure, that the history of colonialism that distances the practice of science from communities, regrettably so. I think there's also sort of implicit hierarchies in the way we approach nature in Western science. For example, the distinction between animals and plants, which goes back to Aristotle and Theophrastus. And also a lack of relationality to place, right? So some of the examples I discuss in the book of deep listening occur in a context of dwelling in place, commitment to place, protocol, relationships, and dialogue. And so from that perspective, the digital listening techniques I've talked about not only seem impoverished and unidimensional, but also exploitative, kind of like an enhanced form of eavesdropping. They are not ethical. They are not rooted in place, and that poses a real problem, I think, for this whole research agenda, as sort of marvelous as it might seem. So one of the things I think that is being discussed now, which is very useful, is this notion of indigenous data sovereignty, the notion that data is held by indigenous communities that are stewards of these territories, that it's we can't go in and harvest this data without seeking consent or asking permission. There are principles, like the fair and care principles. So I think from that discussion, which is happening, with individual scientists and also even at the UN level, I think we're going to get an emergence of a set of protocols that will lead us to a better place.
Hi. So This is kind of in reference to one of the really cool graphics you showed, kind of displaying the embedding space, it looked like, of, I think maybe a bee's language. So I was curious, in reference to like human language, usually you're working with some kind of words or tokens, yeah, exactly, to create that. And I think most, if not all, human languages just naturally have tokens, words to mean different things. I was curious how you come up with those tokens to work with some of these AI models that you're describing to create that embedding space. And then once you are able to create this really cool embedding space of a language, how you decide which language to map it to. Do you map it to English or some human language as an intermediary first, and then to some other organism? Or do you find some other similar animal that makes more sense to map it directly to that animal because maybe we understand its behavior better or something like that?
Those are great questions. And just to be clear, this is not honeybee, this is Portuguese. I don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. Okay, so honeybee language is vibrational and positional, so their abdomen has 6 degrees of freedom. They vibrate it at certain frequencies which are below our hearing range, some are in our hearing range. But when a honeybee is talking to another honeybee, they're moving their whole body, and the bees are often using their antenna and touching the abdomen to get a sense of that position of the bee who's talking in space, because the orientation of the bee's body to gravity and the position of the sun, because they can see polarized light, that's all part of their language. So that's really complex to decode, but you can decode it, and as I mentioned there, we think we know about 200 signals, patterns. If you overlay the bioacoustic data with computer vision, you can sort of isolate certain sounds that are associated with certain kinds of behaviors. We don't know what they mean, but we think we've isolated, I don't want to call them words, but they're specific vocalization units that we think are like the building blocks of honeybee language. So the next question is, as you said, what do we translate it to? And so I think what we're going to end up doing is actually not translating immediately for a while in the way we do with human languages, but rather testing out painstakingly with playback experiments. Okay, if we make that sound, what response does that elicit from the honeybee? They're doing this with bats also, like real-time playback experiments with bats, with robots that can essentially respond in real time when a bat makes a vocalization. The AI can respond as if it were a bat. So this is not something the researchers are doing in advance. They're training the algorithms, and the algorithms are essentially doing the playback in more or less real time. Another cool aspect of this is all of the AI we're doing for recognition of different gestures. So there was a really interesting paper in Science about 2 years ago where they used an AI and they trained it on mouse emotions. So the AI could tell if the mouse was happy or sad, or scared or angry or anxious, just by looking at the set of the eyes, the whiskers, just like we're doing similar things for humans. So training these gestural AIs to interpret certain embodied movements is also probably going to be part of the picture. The next thing that these researchers then want to do is kind of ladder up. So if you have got let's say a database for a sperm whale, you're going to try to translate that to dolphin, because we actually have a pretty good sense of what different dolphin vocalizations mean. So we're not actually going to have zoological version of Google Translate on your phone in 10 years. In 10 years, we might have 200 words in sperm whalish that are more or less connected to vocalization, similar vocalizations in dolphins. That being said, the research always surprises me. It always goes way faster than I think it will.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Could you shed a little more light on how one does listening without a nervous system? How does that work for plants?
I'm going to come closer because I want to hear that again. Yeah?
How do you do listening if you don't have a nervous system?
Okay. Let's go back to basics. So, coral larvae have cilia. So your ear has little hairs inside it, cilia. Think of a coral larva like an inside-out ear. It's covered in cilia. Those cilia help it locomote. They are the device that the coral larva is using to sense sounds as particle motion through water. Similarly, plants, the term uses mechanoreception. So through mechanoreception, the cilia vibrate, and that causes some kind of biological response. In plants, we understand this fairly well. It could be a biochemical response. It can be even rapid expression of genes. We don't quite know what's going on inside the coral larva, but the general answer to your question is we believe that it's some form of mechanoreception to do with the cilia, and it's a great mystery. I mean, one of the wonderful things about this research is Carl von Frisch, who won the Nobel Prize for studying honeybee language in 1973, described it like a magic well. Every time he learned something miraculous about honeybee language, another mystery unfolded. So I don't have an answer to your question. We only have a sort of incomplete hypothesis, but that's where the magic well is at the moment with respect to coral larvae.
Hello. I was wondering, when we take ultra and infrasound and convert it into something that we can hear, how do we know how accurate that is if it's something that we can't have heard before? And is it as simple as speeding it up and slowing it down, and what kind of processing, or do we know how much is lost in translation?
It's a great question. So we'll never know what it would be like to hear like a bat, because bats hear in a way faster than us. The sounds are much higher, much faster. So we don't know how far to slow it down. The sound from that bat was slowed down to the point where it sounds like a warbling bird. I could have, slowed it down more or less. So these are human simulacra of nature's sounds. We don't really actually know what it sounds like to another species. So there are attempts to use like augmented, mixed, and virtual reality to try to get us to live in the bodies of other creatures. You might have heard about those experiments where, like you put on that backpack that vibrates as if you had dragonfly wings, and then you've got your VR headset and you're going through the forest like, I'm a dragonfly. Oh yeah, okay. Well, I don't think it works very well. High risk of bumping into like tree roots and stuff. Okay, so the answer is we really don't know. But what I think is fascinating to think about is we don't know, but our computers and robots might know, and they might or know better or approximate it better, and they might tell us. And that's actually what researchers are now interested in doing. Now, there's kind of like a sci-fi fantasy aspect to all of this, right? Like Babelfish and there's a debate in the community because some researchers argue that actually, whether or not we can communicate with these animals is actually, not the right question. It's not the most important question. It's certainly an anthropocentric question. It's very human-centered. So Miriam Knorrschildt says, I don't actually care if the bat wants to talk to me. It probably doesn't. What would I have to say that would be interesting to a bat? I'm actually much more interested in what bats are saying to each other. And so if we sort of decenter our own importance in this and are asking with more humility what different creatures are saying within their species and between species, that I think sort of is one response to your question.
Hi, I'm channeling my inner 10-year-old, and I have 2 questions for you, since you've gotten all these really cool questions. A, can we see the cute frog so that everybody can go,
oh. Yeah, let's go find the cute frog.
We missed some cute pictures. And then also, I'm gonna go super domestic.
Aww.
And is there any research being done that can help me understand why my two Labrador retrievers behave the way they do with each other,
Oh,
and
yeah.
how I can communicate with them?
The perennial question. So, oh, by the way, there is a group called the Interspecies Internet, which you can join, and they have regular webinars. I don't know if any of you ever saw this TED Talk 10 or 15 years ago. It had Peter Gabriel, the musician, Diana Rice, the dolphin researcher, Vint Cerf, the Google vice president, self-proclaimed father of the internet, and Neil Gershenfeld, who's an MIT researcher. Anyway, they did a TED Talk, and they founded this group called the Interspecies Internet. They talk a lot about dogs in that group, so you can go hang out with them. So yes, they are doing a lot of research on dogs. One of the cool recent studies is dogs can actually distinguish between different human languages. They sort of put them in an MRI and see how they respond to different, English or Spanish. But they're also doing work incorporating acoustics with haptic technology, which you might have heard of. So you can, they create these paired vests. So you could wear one and your dog could wear one. And the vests are picking up like heart rate and skin conductivity and many other things. And they're supposed to sort of enhance your mutual, dog owner telepathy that I'm sure you've experienced. So at the same time, dogs are not very vocally active, and where a lot of the research has concentrated is in these highly vocally active species that have very complex vocalizations. So although we might eventually reach a Google Translate for dolphins, I think dogs are kind of far down the list for the moment. So.
Okay, we're going to do one more question over here on your left.
Okay.
Thanks for the speech. I'm a Navy vet, and so when we went below the water line, you could actually hear the sonar. Do you think we're going to have to ban passive and active sonar? And also, how do we prevent the militarization of this sound technology?
Great question. Yes, so I do think we're going to have far greater restrictions on sonar, seismic. So the amount of underwater pollution has been increasing exponentially since the Second World War period. This creates like an acoustic fog for aquatic species. It's as if you were living in a very thick pea soup fog and you could not even see the hand in front of your face in some of these places. That's how it is experienced. So what it does is it reduces the radius in which species can hunt or leave their young. They simply cannot see the world around them because they see the world through sound, and there's so much noise pollution. So yes, there's going to be a lot of more calls for controls. Of course, the problem is the open ocean is an unregulated space. The international law of the sea doesn't really provide those safeguards, so there's a lot of work to be done. Regarding militarization, the military has a long history with these technologies. There's a whole section in the book about how they were the first ones to discover whale song because they set up the SOSUS network, which is this deep undersea listening network intended to listen for enemy ships, submarines, but in fact turned up these very strange noises that were, perplexing to the Navy technicians and turned out to be whales, right? All types of whales singing underwater. They created some of the first data sets of whale sound, which were highly classified and top secret for decades. So I guess there's no reason to expect that engagement of the military with acoustics would cease. I do think that for a long time it was sort of a unique area of expertise, and there was not a lot of civilian activity in this space. And one of the hopeful signs I see is the proliferation of citizen science. So people are out there with their digital devices, they're also listening. And presumably there would be more awareness if there started to be surreptitious playback, experiments or other things going on. And I think the best defense is sort of a listening citizenry. So I would encourage all of you to check out these apps and start thinking about, citizen science. And that's the best I can offer, but maybe it's a small thing and a joyous thing you can all do, because there is such joy in getting out there and listening to the sounds of nature.
I have one more question. Sorry, this is for me. So I'm curious, we have recordings of bats talking to each other or animals talking to animals of the same species. Are there any kind of studies into how animals talk to other species? Like, do they have to speak to, I don't know, birds in a different language, different bat language? Interspecies communication, I guess is the question.
Yeah, there are studies between different primates. There are studies between different aquatic species, cetaceans, that engage in dialogue playfully, repeatedly, and over years, like periodically coming together and greeting, communicating. Very little of that is formally documented, because I think I said at the outset of the presentation, as humans, we tend to believe what we cannot observe does not exist. But one of the great things about this research is now these digital listening devices are now widely available and in the hands of many biologists and ecologists. This used to be a very arcane specialty. Like when I say arcane, one of the first scientists to start this work, Ivan Rogescu in Slovenia, he used to play insect sounds. You know, one of his first experiments was he had a male insect call a female insect on a very new technology at the time, which was the telephone. So we'd have, you know, them phoning back and forth. This was not mainstream stuff. And the cool thing now is it's just now becoming a part in the toolkit of almost any field scientist. And that's when we're going to start making more of those discoveries about interspecies communication.
Okay, so that's my actual last question. So let's say thank you to Karen Bakker. Thank you very much. And do you want to go through, you had a final slide I think you wanted to show. We have recorded this. We will be posting it online. Check our social media for info on where the video is going to show up, and we'll be able to do that hopefully in the not too distant future. So if you are interested in participating with the NPR Science Friday Book Club, I encourage you to do that. Check out the coupons for getting the 15% off the book from Broadway Books. And if you got 6 or better on the trivia, come up and get a pint glass. And thank you all for coming to Science on Tap.